Hi everyone, welcome back to our On Our Sleeves YouTube channel. I'm Gina McDowell, and today I am joined by our special guest, Dr. Mary Wojnarowski, who is a psychologist with our Child Development Center. Dr. Wojnarowski is here to discuss how we can educate our young ones about developmental differences. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be here and talk about what I think is a really important topic. So thanks for asking me.
Of course, I agree. This is an extremely important topic. So let's start there. Why is it important to talk to our kids about developmental differences?
Yeah, such a great question. I think the short answer is because people with developmental differences are part of our world. I think often adults think that talking about developmental differences or disability brings attention to it and maybe focuses children's attention on something that they hadn't noticed before, but actually children are noticing differences from a very young age, even as young as infancy and toddlerhood. So children are noticing early, whether we want them to or not, and they're curious. So talking to typically developing kids about developmental disabilities helps answer their naturally curious questions, helps build empathy and compassion, teaches them how to interact with children and adults with developmental differences, and then helps create an inclusive and supportive world for people with disabilities.
Absolutely. For our parents that are getting ready to have these conversations, what are the important things that they can say to their kids during a conversation about developmental differences?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, because kids are noticing differences from an early age, we want to start talking with them about those differences from an early age as well. Just making sure that we're using developmentally appropriate language. But we want to be open, honest, allow them to answer the questions that they have. Make sure that we're being truthful about differences. Making a comment that's not accurate, especially if it's something that the child has observed themselves, can allow them to fill in the discrepancy with details, and sometimes those details or the events that they use to make sense of what they're seeing is worse than the actual truth. So make sure that you're providing honest, matter-of-fact, straightforward information about differences, about what disability is and what it isn't. People with developmental differences are born with differences, but they're not necessarily sick. They may learn differently than other children or interact with people in a different way. Potentially, they need extra help in school from the teacher, or maybe even extra support from adults to move around the environment. I think one great resource is that there are many children's books that are available for kids that talk about developmental differences. Just make sure that you're reading through the book yourself before sharing it with your child. You can also ask your child's teacher or pediatrician for recommendations about books or resources. I think a really critical thing is, while we're identifying differences, it's also important to identify similarities between people with developmental differences and people who are typically developing. So, for example, you might say something like, yes, Johnny may learn differently from you and needs extra help from the teacher in math, or gets around his world in a wheelchair, but he loves Minecraft just like you. So we want to make sure that different is not explained or perceived as bad, and really important for us as parents to model acceptance and inclusion and use non-offensive language. Parents can also provide concrete examples of ways that their children can be kind to or help children or adults with developmental differences, and make sure that we're praising and recognizing children when they are doing these things. We also want to make sure that kids know that they need to ask before providing support to someone. Encouraging interaction with people with developmental differences is also a really great way to address this topic with our kids. Your children can invite other kids with developmental differences to birthday parties, or your child can participate in extracurricular activities that are inclusive of people with developmental differences. There's some research that shows that young adults who encountered children with developmental differences at their school when they were younger are much more sensitive to and appreciative of developmental differences and abilities in those people. And many schools actually have structured programs that's part of their general curriculum to provide education to their students about developmental differences. And finally, we want to make sure that this conversation is ongoing. A one-time conversation is probably not enough to help a child understand all that we want them to understand. And they may have ongoing questions or new questions that come up about developmental differences. So we just want to make sure that we're revisiting the conversation as much as is needed for our children.
I love these recommendations for our caregivers. I think, you bring up a good point about, if they have questions, let's address those questions. For our caregivers, though, what should they do if a child does ask a question that they're not sure how to answer?
Yes, and that's a good question because it probably will happen. So you just have to know that don't be afraid to say, I don't know, or gosh, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer right now. Let me find out and get back to you. I think it's really important for parents to feel comfortable when talking to their children about developmental differences. So take whatever time is needed to learn and feel comfortable about having the discussion before you're actually having it. If parents are uncomfortable or avoid the topic, again, this can teach children that developmental differences are bad or scary or something to be ashamed of, and maybe even communicate that people with disabilities should be avoided. I think another great thing is that there are a lot of websites online that provide further guidance for talking with your child about developmental differences if you're seeking more information.
I think that's a great recommendation. And I think some of our caregivers may feel, I don't know, or they might think, I don't know how to respond or correct something if I hear my child say it. So what are some ways that caregivers might be able to respond to their child if they either ask a question or maybe they say something that could potentially be offensive to someone with developmental difference?
Sure. And I think all parents have had this experience. So I think, if you're in public and your child asks a question out of curiosity and potentially in front of the person with a developmental difference, it's important to try to remain calm and realize that your child is probably just being curious and not necessarily intending to be mean or hurtful. Shushing our children or rushing away or getting mad, again, can teach that child that developmental differences are bad and should not be talked about. Some people with developmental differences or parents of children with developmental differences may take the time to answer your child's question and to talk about, their developmental difference, or they may not want to. And of course, that's their choice. It's up to them whether they want to do that or not. But it's important for parents to try to answer the question that the child asked later, honestly, but also to tell your child that sometimes it's not polite or kind to point out differences loudly, and it'd be better to ask the question later and in private. I think one thing is that it's never too late, to start talking about this topic and to building empathy and compassion in our kids.
This goes along with many of our topics about, having the conversations with our kids about feelings or whatever it might be. And I think the more conversations we have, the more we can normalize this, the more we can provide that open space for those questions, and then to provide our children with education around this and very important topic. So thank you so much for sharing these recommendations with our families today.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and that is all we have for you at home today. I hope you have found this to be helpful. As always, don't forget to like us and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.